All right, I'm here today with Steve Blank. I'm very excited to have Steve make the time for me and for my readers. Excited to hear some of his thoughts on some of his past works, as well as some of the other books that are out there in the lean startup world. So I want to go back in time. Klaus Schauser is a mutual friend of ours, founder of Expert City, which we sold to Citrix, which I was part of that story, and still very good friends with Klaus. A huge proponent of Four Steps to the Epiphany. He's probably given away more of those books than most people. And I got a very early copy of that, and it's wonderful. You were way ahead of that, whole lean startup curve. If you were writing the Four Steps to the Epiphany today, how would it be different? Now that some time has elapsed?
So I am writing the Four Steps to the Epiphany today.
Excellent.
In conjunction with the online class I'm going to do at Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, if you have the original version, it probably was printed on tree bark at Cafe Press.
I have the Cafe Press version. Yes.
I have to tell you, and for your viewers, if it's of interest, the story of how that ended up as a book rather than my class notes is traced all the way back to Eric Ries. Eric is now known as the Lean Startup fame.
Yep.
Was my student in one of the very earliest customer development classes at Berkeley, best student I ever had. And the Four Steps was essentially my class notes. And Eric said, "Don't you know you could put this stuff on Amazon?" And I went, "What?"
Nice.
So the fact that these badly edited, missing sentences, complete your own and finish your own sentences, the version of the book, was basically we could all blame it on Eric. And I have to thank him for that. And we should get back to Eric's contribution, which has been enormous. But the Four Steps, you have to remember 10 years ago, basically venture and entrepreneurship was startups are nothing more than a smaller version of a large company.
Yeah.
That was the implicit statement. Everything you learned in business school, it's appropriate for startups. And down to the conceit that large companies write business plans. Why, of course, that's the organizing document for a startup.
Mm-hmm.
10 years later, we can now articulate, which we couldn't at the time, and I couldn't at the time, the distinction, which is very important. Startups are not smaller versions of large companies. Large companies, essentially, at their core, what they do on a daily basis is execute known business models.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, they're organized around execution. VPs of sales, P&L, revenue plans, etc. And when they want to introduce a new product, it's usually a sustaining innovation that understands who their customers are, who their markets are. A revenue forecast isn't a fantasy. It's an extension of a lot of knowns. And so a business plan in a large corporation makes all the sense in the world. Yet a startup knows none of that, except for corner cases, those that are doing clones or entering in existing markets. But most startups fall in the category where you're dealing with a series of multiple unknowns.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we took this document, the business plan, because we knew nothing else, and said, well, go write one of these. And we ended up with something called Appendix A, which was the revenue forecast, which should have been taught in the creative writing department in the English department,
right.
But we had nothing else. So we now know what startups do are they search for a business model. And the people who search and the techniques that you use for search and the culture of search and how you finance search is radically different on how you finance execution and how you staff execution and how you plan execution.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we couldn't articulate it this simply a decade ago. In fact, to me, my definition of a startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. That's what you're doing. And when you find one, you become a company. And if you don't find one, you become an X company or an X startup.
Right.
And so customer development, in hindsight, I wish I could tell you I was that prescient, was the first of what I'll consider to be an emerging stack of entrepreneurial management tools akin to what we developed in the United States as part of the MBA 100 years ago for execution.
Mm-hmm.
Just as an aside, John, and cut me off if I'm babbling, but it's really instructive to look back and think about where the MBA came from. The origin of the modern corporation probably traced back to the East India Company, 1600.
Mm-hmm.
Greeks and Romans had things that looked like companies, but let's just take 1600 as a starting date. Corporations evolved for 300 years to about the early 20th century, 1900. And in 1908, someone at Harvard looked at the 300 years of corporate history and said, hey, why don't we concatenate best practices of how to run corporations and offer a degree-granting program where none ever existed before called the Masters of Business Administration. And we will teach a cohort, a cadre of new management in the emerging industrial explosion in the United States, who at the time was going from local businesses to regional corporations to national corporations who needed a nation of professional management for growth and expansion. They weren't the masters of startups, they were the masters of business administration. And for 100 years, those programs, MBAs, helped drive the American century. First nationally and then post-World War II internationally. Full stop. Just hold that idea. For 50 years in Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, we've invented a new class of business, the intersection of risk capital and technology entrepreneurship. Right? This is what we now call startups and technology startups. It's as a business in its modern form, could be traced back to General George Doreau at American Research and Development in 1947, the rise of the limited partnership in Silicon Valley in the late 60s, early 70s. So at best, we could let's put a stake in the ground and say 50 years old. But for the first 50 years, my contention is venture capitalists took the business skills and processes they knew from their MBA and finance courses and overlaid it on startups. With all due respect, that if VCs were creative, they would have been entrepreneurs. They're, in fact, my contention, a financial asset class with gambler's instincts. Kind of like the housing people.
Right.
But in any case, we had no tools of our own. And what I'm suggesting is that my work, Eric Ries's work, Alexander Osterwalder's work, everybody else's work is now in the last, I'd say, 3 to 5 years, building up our equivalent stack of what are the management tools we use to think about entrepreneurship the first year or two, when we're still searching in the woods, giving us some heuristics and rules, just like the people who built companies in the early 20th century now had operations theory and how to do corporate HR and the distributed accounting, etc. Those were the tools that they never had before.
Right.
So I like to think of my work in customer development as kind of one of the first, but soon to be many building blocks that will create an entire stack. Does this help? But I didn't answer your question, by the way, which is what's different. Can I answer the what's different?
Please.
So the new version of the book basically now realizes that there's a lot of new and interesting work. And the best piece that I have found in classes that I now teach and to help entrepreneurs organize their thoughts is using Alexander Osterwalder's Business Model Generation book as the front end for entrepreneurs thinking about their business. That is, Osterwalder says any company can be described in a business model of 9 boxes. And unlike my book, which is a bunch of turgid text, his book is all pictures and very easy for anybody to understand. And I make my students now draw Osterwalder's canvas as the organizing way to think about your hypotheses. That is, the whole shtick about customer development, which is still true, is, thanks for your opinion, but unless you're a domain expert, my bet is most of your startup is a series of untested and unproven hypotheses. Glad you have them, happy to fund you or not or whatever. But the whole idea of customer development was to get out of the building and systematically test those hypotheses as quickly as you can, as cheaply as you can, without scaling first, like you would do in a large company. Osterwalder, to me, is now a great front end of how to visually organize those. So that's the one sea change. I integrate his work. We teach together at times. He comes into my classes. My addition to his work is he originally thought of the business model canvas as a static diagram. What I have found is when used in entrepreneurship is that there's a z-axis to it. That is, if you think about it, your canvas is going to change over time as you get out and use customer development. Now, all of a sudden, there's a stack of canvases. The second part is the most obvious, but I didn't see it at the time. There's a different speed and a different customer development process. Still 4 steps, but the tactics are radically different for web and mobile apps. Web influence on. That is, things that where you could get feedback almost instantaneously, and the cost of entry and the cost of iteration is as close to zero as technology will allow us to get.
Mm-hmm.
What I'll call virtual products and virtual channels are distinctly different from physical products and physical channels in terms of dollars needed to be invested and time to iterate and cycle. It's not that the process is different, it's just that the speed allows you to do some very different things.
Right.
So the new version of 4 Steps specifically addresses how to build a web and mobile startup and distinguishes the path from physical products to virtual products.
Wow, I look forward to reading it.
Yeah, that was a half-hour answer to a 30-second question.
Oh no, that was all good. And I was nodding a lot when you were talking about the MBA. I'm an MBA refugee. I went to Wharton with this idea that I went there to study entrepreneurship, and I tell my students, good gosh, please don't do that. Don't make the mistake that I made. If you really feel like you're an entrepreneur, and I had been my whole life, going to to school to learn it is probably a mistake. And I also love the fact that Joseph Wharton didn't go to college. I think that tells you a whole lot about the need for an MBA if you're truly an entrepreneur.
Well, if you think about it, there's 2 problems, and let's not write off the MBAs yet, but the problem historically had been, if you're a business school professor, you make additional income outside the school consulting.
Yep.
Where do you consult for? Gee, if you're great, you consult for IBM, Procter & Gamble, GE, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Large companies. By definition, large companies who could write you large checks.
Right.
And then someone says, gee, why don't you teach us about startups? And as a business school professor, no conceit and no arrogance, but just an assumption, startups, how hard could that be? Yep. Startups are smaller versions of large companies. And that's where we ran into trouble in business schools, is thinking that they were a simple extension of the knowledge base of large corporations.
Mm-hmm.
My position is a fairly radical, but I think correct one that says, no, most of the things you learn on how to execute a company are actually destructive in the first year or 2 of a startup. Mm-hmm. Eventually, they converge. Yep. But you need a different body of knowledge that you will not get as a business school professor consulting for large corporations. So this is why entrepreneurship in universities, I believe, are not best taught, but are helped when they're taught by adjuncts with startup entrepreneurial experience, either as venture capitalists or as retired entrepreneurs.
Yep. Yeah, and that's
one. But 2 is, there really is a great 21st century role for business schools in entrepreneurship, and I think that's dealing with the ever-increasing rate of disruption in large corporations. 15 years ago, Clayton Christensen at Harvard wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, which I still think is the gold standard for corporate thinking about entrepreneurship. He said, listen, large company, and he said lots of things, but he said large companies do 2 types of innovation. Sustaining innovation, that is along the axis of our core product, how to make it faster and cheaper and better. And large corporations, if they do well because they're great at that. But they also have to deal with another type of innovation, one outside of their control, and that's disruptive innovation. That's innovation typically coming outside the company. Laws change, technology changes, consumer taste change, new competitors, the whole list of Porter's, what affects large corporations. These disruptions are what typically put large companies out of business. And if you don't believe this, go ask Nokia and RIM this week.
Right.
These were the world's best companies in sustaining innovation. These guys were continually making their phones cheaper and smaller and faster and better. Get some guys from Cupertino who didn't read the sustaining innovation book said, we're going to reinvent the entire phone business. And what always happens in disruptive innovations is that the large companies laugh at the disruptors.
Always.
Always. Oh, it's too small. It's not our market. It's a niche. It's a, we could now make the entire list. So I've been curious about this. Why haven't we gotten how to do entrepreneurship in large corporations right? Mm-hmm. And the answer is we didn't even understand how to get entrepreneurship right in its pristine environment as a startup. That is, until we understood how to build startups without having to deal with HR and finance and large corporate goals, and we couldn't even figure out how to do it in Silicon Valley, let alone doing it in corporations.
Right.
So this is a long way to say, I believe we're well on our way to cracking the entrepreneurship code for startups. And therefore, one of the classes I'm going to try to teach at Columbia this spring is corporate entrepreneurship.
Ah.
How to translate some of the lessons we've learned in Silicon Valley in the last 2 or 3 years and see if we could come up with a canonical model on how to deal with both the sustaining and disruptive innovation in large corporations. And what would a perfect model look like, and why does it often fail? Existing corporate structures. Again, Christensen and the innovator solution, I still think is the gold standard of trying to explain that to a lay audience. But I think we could take it to the next step. So,
well, good luck with that. You get your hands full. That's quite a.
The most fun thing I think I'm going to do, and don't ask me how, is in February, we're going to take my current Stanford class called the Lean Launchpad and offer it online for free.
Nice.
In 10, 50-minute sessions. And today is December 2011. As of today, we have 32,000 people signed up to take the class.
Fantastic.
I'm kind of a little scared to see what it's going to look like by February, but I'll give you a hint. I'm not grading the papers.
That's right. That's awesome. Well, I look forward to that as well. Well, good luck with that. I think you're right in the sense that I'm down on the MBA circa late 80s when I graduated. I graduated in 89. I had one professor that was an entrepreneur. All the rest of them, they were doing their best, but they were tenured professors that didn't. You're right. They were consulting up and down the East Coast with big companies and were just asked to teach some startup classes. So you mentioned Eric Ries. He's just on fire right now. It's great to see his book doing so well. How has he added to the stack that you were describing? I know you guys have known each other, been supporters of each other for a long time. How is he adding to that stack?
So, the Eric story is, I think, essential to the creation of the stack. I was more than happy just teaching customer development, not focusing, not even understanding the engineering component. I just kind of assumed that you would have to deal with waterfall development.
Yep.
Having been out of companies and that not being my expertise. Eric was taking my class in Berkeley because the only way I would fund IMVU, the company he was a co-founder of, is if him and his co-founder actually sat through the class, because his co-founder, who I loved, who had been my VP of engineering, Will Harvey, had cratered the last two companies. So I wanted, no, with my help. But I wanted them to actually sit through this process. And of course, Eric got it faster than anybody I had ever seen. Went back to IMVU. I was sitting on the board as one of the early investors, and actually implemented the first full-fledged customer development combined with agile engineering. It was the first implementation. So Eric was the, gee, Steve, that was nice in theory, but let me put it in practice guy. And he took it to a new level. He combined customer development and agile engineering in a way that no one had before. And out of that, he derived a whole series of insights, which became the Lean Startup. And if you decompose the Lean Startup, you could see a lot of customer development in there. But in his book, he actually took the Lean method past the startup world into a much wider audience and said, hey, this is how we're going to revolutionize corporate innovation in the 21st century. And I think it's an important story to be told. And hopefully Eric will continue to do this, because he's not only just, like me, some old retired marketeer. Eric is a guy who's actually built this stuff and has seen it work. And so he has credibility to me anytime he opens his mouth to a room full of developers, as well as business executives. He knows from whence he speaks. And so I think of Eric as, of all the practitioners who are adding value in this stack, I think, our goal is to prove this, not just talk about this. Eric has a set of proof points. I have some. I'm trying some science experiments with GE as well, in large corporations, and I think we're actually seeing some major shifts on both startups and corporations. But I think Eric's work is just incredibly important and incredibly valuable.
Yep. Well, I think he comes from, a place of credibility. He's written a great book, and then thirdly, I think in his arsenal is he's just incredibly articulate and engaging. I haven't met him, but just the interviews I've seen with him, I think he's got a long career ahead of him, as you suggest.
Long career.
Yeah, which is wonderful. Good for everyone in the startup world. Well, Steve, I really do appreciate your time, and good luck with the class at Harvard. Good luck with the online class at Stanford. Good luck with the new version of Four Steps. I think that's some amazing work in front of you, and again, that's going to push the boundaries of entrepreneurship for everyone. So thanks again. I do appreciate you taking the time.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
We can get together. Take care. Bye-bye.